This conference will now be recorded.
There it is. It's being recorded. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. We are just at about at the point where we're going to start here. Make sure you can see the folks who are here in person. If you're watching us online, I'll try to get out of the way a little bit. Get this. And we're excited to turn the page on Jacob this morning after a couple of weeks and go into Joseph and Joseph's life. Now, just like Jacob is only given a few lines of Hebrews chapter 11, so too Joseph only has a few lines of Hebrews chapter 11. That'll change when we get to our next hero of faith, Moses. We have an awful lot that's talked about in Hebrews 11, but we still, of course, have a lot of information on Joseph in the book of Genesis too that we'll be referencing this morning. So, by way of introduction, can you think of a hero who became rich and famous but never forgot his or her humble roots?
A lot of these country western stars,
I suppose. Yeah, the country western stars. It was brought up.
The coal miner's daughter.
Loretta Lynn, the coal miner's daughter. Yeah. I think Dolly Parton would be a good example of that too. She's certainly rich and famous. She's got her own amusement park, and yet she lives very close to where she grew up. And I believe she and her husband have been married for over 50 years, and that's quite an achievement, especially for a celebrity. And there is a road in rural Kentucky that's sometimes called the Country Western Road, I think, because so many country western stars grew up on that U.S. highway in eastern Kentucky. I think it might be Highway 24. I'd have to look that up for sure, but
Highway 24 is down there.
Is it? Okay, I think that's it, that US Highway 24. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. How about anyone else? A hero who became rich and famous but never forgot his or her humble roots.
Roberto Clemente.
Roberto Clemente. Ah, yes. 1972 he died, and died as he was bringing aid to people in, was it Puerto Rico or the Dominican? I know he's from the Dominican, but somewhere in the Caribbean. He died in a plane crash, and he was trying to bring them aid. And so he's got that very round number there of exactly 3,000 hits. He got his 3,000th hit on the last day of the season, and then in the off season he died. Played his entire career for the Pirates, but yeah, you'll see that too with some of these famous athletes from the Dominican, from the Caribbean. They go back every year to their hometowns, and they are just regular people. I remember David Ortiz of the Red Sox was the same way, that he would just go back to his hometown, and of course he was a very well-to-do person by the time he went back, but to the people who knew him, he was still the same old guy.
He was the one that got shot last year, wasn't
he? Yeah, he got shot in a bar. Yeah.
Last year, right?
Yes, I believe it was last year. Yeah. Sometimes it might be better if they left some of their roots behind. Yeah. But it is, I think we regard that as a good thing when someone doesn't get all high and mighty about what they've become and remembers where they came from, remembers their extended family members and such, and perhaps even uses some of their fame and wealth to benefit other people that they've known all of their lives too. There's an old saying too, be careful about stepping up over people on the way up, because you meet those same people when you're on the way down. No one stays rich and famous and at the top of life forever. I mean, very few people seem to anyway. So we do see that with Joseph as well too, that Joseph, even with the great position that he is granted in the middle of his life, never forgets his roots, and most importantly, never forgets his God. Hebrews 11 sums up Joseph's life of faith this way. By faith, Joseph, as he neared the end of his life, mentioned the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave instructions about his bones. Again, we have something similar to what we talked about the last couple of weeks with Jacob, where you could pick out all sorts of things from Jacob's life, but the one thing that the writer to the Hebrews picks out is the end of Jacob's life and what Jacob does in blessing the children of Joseph. Well, now same thing with Joseph. So many things that we're going to talk about regarding Joseph today and next week, but the writer to the Hebrews sums up Joseph's life with what he does at the end when he talks about how they're going to come out of Egypt, go back to Israel, and what they should do with his bones.
Why do you think that is then? Why would you think that is if we just pick up at the end of his life?
Well, the simple answer is because that's what the Spirit inspired the writer to the Hebrews to write. But then digging into it a little more, you can see a thread that goes through Hebrews. The important thing isn't what wonderful things God did for a person in their earthly life to make their earthly life better. The important thing with these heroes of faith is how God used them and their descendants to bring the Savior into the world. And so it is with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. The important thing isn't, the events of their life as much as it is what God is doing in keeping the promise and their faith in that promise. Their faith in the promise is more important than whatever it is they're going through or whatever success they're experiencing. And so that's what's picked up. And it'll be the same thing with Moses. Now we should note too, and I'm glad you brought that up, that we do have a bit of a departure when we come to Joseph, because you've got Abraham, son Isaac, grandson Jacob, great-grandson Joseph, but with the great-grandson, now we are veering away from the one through whom the promise is going to be kept. Joseph is not the one with the birthright. That's Judah. And we will talk about that next week a little bit. But Joseph isn't the son of the promise, but he's still a wonderful example of faith because he trusts in the promise, and God uses him to preserve his family as well. Okay, anything else on Hebrews 11's summary of Joseph before we go on to some of the details of his life? And I'll apologize right up front. This may leave you wanting more, or certainly you'll say, wait a second, what about that? We're not going to be able to cover every aspect of Joseph's life in 2 weeks. So there will be some instances where you kind of fill in the blanks given what you know of Joseph already. And we'll try to do that as well in discussing these things. But first of all, Joseph's background is described in Genesis chapter 37, and we'll read those printed verses there. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his other sons because he was the son born in his old age, and he made him a special robe. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him in a friendly way. Okay, why would Jacob have had a special love for Joseph?
Because of his wife.
Because of his wife. God saw that the wife that Jacob never intended to have, Leah, wasn't loved by Jacob. So God blessed Leah with the ability to bear children. Then you've got the rivalry between the sisters that we mentioned last week, where Rachel gives her servant to Jacob to conceive children with, and Leah gives her servant to Jacob to conceive children with, and then Leah conceives another 2 sons. Finally, after Jacob has had 10 sons, God has mercy on Rachel and allows her to conceive Joseph. Now, by the time we get to, besides that too, by the time we get to the events of Joseph's life, Rachel is dead as well because she gave birth to one more son, Benjamin, and she died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. So Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel, is gone, and he's got two sons by Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. And he has this special love for Joseph. He shows that love with the special robe. A lot of times we might remember the King James translation, robe of many colors. Doesn't necessarily have to have been a robe of many colors. The NIV translation was richly ornamented robe. Even that is kind of an extrapolation of what's literally here. It's a special robe. It's something that sets Joseph apart. And what exactly it was, maybe it had many colors, maybe it was richly ornamented. It was something that set him apart. And you think of how life was in that day and age. People generally had one set of clothing that they wore until it wore out, and then you'd fashion yourself another set of clothing. You didn't have a closet full of clothes. But Jacob makes Joseph this special robe. That's quite a statement on Jacob's part concerning his love for Joseph. And of course, it's going to really stick in the craw of Joseph's older half brothers. So we ask then, must a parent love all their children equally?
It seems like they should. Do they? Not always.
They should. That's the ideal. It would be the ideal, of course, if every parent had equal love for every one of their children. Yeah. Does it happen? Of course not. Is it a sin necessarily if a parent loves one child more than another?
Do we love everybody equally?
Yeah, of course. Do we love everyone? Do we love all our neighbors equally? Don't we have special affection for some people more than others? It certainly can be that way with children. There certainly needs to be what you might call a base level of love that a parent has for a child. The child may do something or display characteristics that make a parent love them more. We do have to talk for a little bit then what is the nature of love? If love is a reciprocal thing where I love you based on what you do for me, well, certainly aren't some people going to do more for you than other people and thus engender more love inside of you? That only makes sense. If love is a selfless act, though, then it doesn't matter who a person is or what they do. You can love them with that same love anyway. Of course, that's the love that we are called to as Christians. So a parent should have that love for everyone, for their children, of course, but also for everyone that desires their salvation, that desires what's best for them. And yet, when we think of love on a lower level, the reciprocal, you did this for me, it makes me feel really good about you. It's only natural, I suppose, that we'd have that lower level kind of love in more regards for some people rather than others, and that could include children more than others, some children more than others too. I think we'd agree, though, that it's probably not wise for a parent to flaunt a different level of affection for one child over against the others, as Jacob does here. I don't know that you can call what Jacob did actually a sin per se, but it's not wise. Give Joseph this special robe and appoint him at age 17 to be kind of the overseer over his older half brothers. Not very wise. And though you can't condone it, you can kind of understand his brother's reaction. They hate him. They can't even speak civilly to him. Any other comments on that? before we move on to the next question. Okay, this is an important point here. Throughout Joseph's life, we can see parallels to Jesus' life some 1800 years later. What parallels can we see in just these few verses?
The Father loves Jesus more than he loves us.
There is a special love of Father for Son, yes, and the Father has no problem declaring that love. The Father declared his love for Jesus on multiple occasions, at Jesus' baptism, at Jesus' transfiguration. A voice from heaven came down on Maundy Thursday while Jesus was praying for his disciples. The Father answered him. Jesus, while praying for Lazarus, confessed the Father's great love for him. This is my Son whom I love. Listen to him. There's a special love between God the Father and God the Son. Other parallels between these few verses and what we see of Joseph in these few verses and Jesus.
Boy, I went blank.
The friendly way too, that his brothers couldn't speak to him in a friendly way, and the people that were following Jesus said, crucify him, crucify him.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a turning of tide.
Yeah, exactly. And did Joseph do anything to deserve his brother's hatred? No. Joseph is one of these rare people in Bible history that we have a fair amount of detail about, and we can't pin anything on Joseph and say, you did that wrong, Joseph. We see you doing something wrong. Joseph is innocent when it comes to his brother's hatred of him. And yet their hatred is so intense, they're willing to take his life or come close to taking his life. They're willing to consider it at least. Same thing with Jesus. Did Jesus ever do anything to deserve anyone's hatred? He lived his life perfectly. He loved everybody. And his treatment is a testimony to the inbred sinfulness that all human beings have. They hated the perfect one more so than they'd hate one of their own. So Joseph is undeservedly hated by those who should rejoice in what a good guy he is. He really does come across all the way through as a good guy. This isn't to say that Joseph was sinless. We're never told that Joseph was sinless. We just don't have any of his sins recorded for us. And that's by design too, so that we can have these parallels that we can note between him and Jesus. Joseph serves as one of the best examples then of what we call a type of Christ. That is a preview of Christ in so many ways. Okay, so there is an instance that we leave out here in our consideration for this morning, but we'll just mention it briefly. Joseph did have a series of dreams when he was 17 years old. He dreamt that the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. He dreamt that he and his brothers and parents were making sheaves of grain, and the sheaves of everyone in his family bowed down to him. And he recounted those, and his brothers hated him even more because the message seemed to be, hey, God seems to be saying you're all going to bow down to me someday. What does that mean? His brothers didn't want to hear that. Even Jacob rebuked Joseph and said, well, that's just not right, son, that you should say something like that. But Joseph was just recounting the dream that God had sent him. And of course, dreams play a very important role in Joseph's life going forward too. So So with that as fuel on the fire of his brother's hatred, the hatred of Joseph's brothers led them to commit a rash act. We'll read verse 28 of Genesis 37. As the Midianites, who were merchants, were passing by, the brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. They brought Joseph to Egypt. So they sell their brother as a slave, make some money out of the deal. The money isn't the important thing, though. The important thing is that they're rid of Joseph. And they go on and deceive their father. They take that special robe and dip it in animal's blood, say, look what we found, Dad. Something bad happened to Joseph. And Jacob is convinced that an animal mauled Joseph to death. And as far as the brothers are concerned, well, that's it for Joseph now. They shouldn't have to worry about him anymore. What other parallels to Jesus' life can we note here?
Betrayal with money.
Betrayal with money, pieces of silver. Yeah, you can't read the 20 pieces of silver and think, I know 20 pieces plus 10 are going to come into play later in Bible history too. Yeah. There's another slightly more obscure parallel to the life of Joseph too.
When Jesus went and his family went down to Egypt.
Yes. So that out of Egypt I called my son is a prophecy. And Joseph goes down to Egypt as Jesus goes down to Egypt in his youth. And Joseph isn't going to come up alive out of Egypt, but we go again to what Hebrews 11 says about Joseph. Joseph wants to make sure his bones get carried out of Egypt as well. So whatever Joseph thinks about being in Egypt and whatever he experiences there in Egypt, he doesn't want to consider Egypt his home, but it is a place where God means for him to be for a time. And same thing with Jesus. God means for Jesus to be down in Egypt for a time, and then he'll call him back. Okay, anything else on Joseph being sold into slavery? We'll just note quickly too the circumstances of that as Joseph rode to them wearing his robe, his brothers took him, grabbed him off of his mount and threw him into the cistern. And it was their idea at first to kill him. Let's kill him. They, in a sense, cooler heads prevailed. Reuben said, no, let's throw him into the cistern, the oldest one. And then Reuben said, well, okay. In his mind, he said, I'll just pull him out later. I can't kill the guy. But it was Judah who had the bright idea to sell him into slavery while Reuben seemed to be away. So the other brothers besides Reuben had their lunch while Joseph is in the cistern, saw the Midianites and sold them into slavery. Reuben came back and the boy was gone. Like, uh-oh. Now they had to, in their minds, they had to come up with a ruse to explain to Jacob why Joseph wasn't coming back anymore. So they killed an animal, dipped his robe in the animal's blood, and gave it to Jacob.
Was Benjamin part of this?
Benjamin seems to have been too young to be out. Joseph is 17. We usually figure Benjamin is probably 10 years younger than Joseph. So Benjamin would have still been at home. Okay, well, let's move on to the longer section here from Genesis 39. While we have Joseph in Egypt, we have selected verses from Genesis 39. And I'll just note here, I've chopped it up. We've got verses 7 through 9, and then we do 18 through 20. So Joseph ends his speech at the end of verse 9, and then without any introduction, I've got Potiphar's wife talking in verse 18. So as we're reading it, if that seems a little jarring, just know that that's coming. We're going to go from Joseph speaking to Potiphar's wife speaking to her husband rather quickly. Okay, the Lord was with Joseph and he became successful. He served in the house of his master, the Egyptian. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made everything that he touched a success. Sometime after all this, his master's wife had her eye on Joseph, and she said, "Come, lie down with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not concern himself with anything that has been entrusted to me in the house. He has put me in charge of everything that he has. He has no one in this house greater than I am, and he has not withheld anything from me, except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a great evil and sin against God? And look, when I screamed and cried out, he left his garment with me and ran outside. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, 'This is what your servant did to me,' he became very angry. Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was kept in prison there." Okay, what parallels to the life of Christ do we find in this episode of Joseph's life?
He was tempted in every way but didn't sin.
Yes, tempted in every way, but did not sin. And now think of the confession that Joseph makes here in verse 9. How could I do such a great evil and sin against God? What's the sin that he's being tempted to commit? Adultery. Yeah, and here's Potiphar's wife. I don't think it'd be going out on a limb to say there's a very good chance Potiphar's wife has committed adultery before. It's probably not that big a deal to her. And who knows what Potiphar thinks of the whole thing too. Potiphar is an important man. An important man very well may have more than one wife or more than one partner. For that matter, Potiphar and his wife are not believers in the true God, as far as we can ascertain. It certainly doesn't seem to, they don't seem to be, and it would be a very rare circumstance if there in Egypt they were somehow followers of the true God. But God regards their marriage, troubled though it might be, pagan though it might be, as a sacred institution. And Joseph recognizes that. Says, I can't commit this great wickedness and sin against God. Leading up to that, he says, look at what God has done for me through my master, your husband. He's put me in charge. He doesn't withhold anything from me. And I can't repay my master by taking his wife like that. And most importantly, he doesn't even list Potiphar as the one that he'd be sinning against. He says, I can't commit this great wickedness and sin against God. According to a person's lust, they could easily rationalize something like that, committing that particular sin. Well, if it's not with me, it's going to be with someone else because that's the type of woman this is. So what does it really matter? And what is this marriage anyway to God, to two unbelievers? Joseph rightfully calls it a great wickedness and sin against God. Jesus also said that as long as he was on earth, not the least stroke of a pen would depart from the law. Jesus upheld God's law in every single way. Linda, you were going to say something.
Well, even like today, if you're married in front of a judge, okay, it's not in a church, but it's still a legally binding marriage. It should be.
Right. Marriage is marriage. If two people have committed to each other and that marriage is civilly recognized, that's a marriage. And whether it was done in a church, in a Buddhist temple, in front of a judge, it's a marriage and needs to be honored as such by God's people. So Joseph rightfully acknowledges that it would be a great evil and a sin against God. to insert himself into Potiphar and Mrs. Potiphar's marriage. So, other parallels to the life of Christ that we could find? Falsely accused, yes. So when one of the verses that's cut out here is that she grabs for him and he runs away, leaving his outer robe in her hands. And that's her evidence then. Look, he attacked me. I screamed. It's pretty flimsy evidence, but it's going to get Joseph thrown into prison. So, anyone have any other parallels? I suppose it's sort of a lesser one, but you could say Joseph was absolutely faithful to that to do that which was entrusted to him. Jesus confesses the same thing about himself on Maundy Thursday when he prays to his Father and says, "I have not lost one of those that you have entrusted to me." Joseph is given a task. Joseph does that task to the best of his abilities. And whenever he does a task, whoever is overseeing him sees, wow, this guy is good. This guy does good work.
When people got thrown into prison back then, I know sometimes it said that if somebody would pay their debt, they would get out of prison. But in an instance like this, it was just that a master throwing someone in prison. Did they ever have a chance to get out of prison, or are they generally there the rest of their life because there was no money to be paid for them to get out of prison?
Well, we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Oh, really?
You don't get the Dennis Tischendorf jumping ahead award necessarily because it's not obvious, but we're going to talk about that in the context of the last question of this section. So it's a good point to bring up. Yeah. But let's consider this first. What challenges to his faith did Joseph face during his time in Egypt? Lack of community is right. Joseph is by himself. Joseph, for all we know, might be the only practicing believer in the true God in the whole land of Egypt. How has Joseph lived his life up to this point? He has been the favored son of a rich man in Canaan. Now all of a sudden he's a slave. To have that drastic turn of events, even though in his work as a slave, he's recognized as someone who's worthy of being made an overseer, he's still a slave. And with that drastic turn of events in his life, isn't a person tempted at such a time to say, God, what are you doing with me? I don't deserve this. Did Joseph deserve to be sold into slavery or separated from his father? No, but
when Pharaoh got him out of prison and gave him his position because of his interpretation of the dreams, was he still considered a slave to Pharaoh, being a number two person, or does that?
I suppose up until the point where Pharaoh gives him his position, yeah, he's still Potiphar's slave. Yeah. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. Other challenges to Joseph's faith besides being alone, besides having that turn of events in his life that might make him doubt the goodness of God? Maybe it's similar to what we had just talked about, but Joseph works very hard to do the right thing. And don't we usually teach people, and it is true to do this, it's a good thing to do this, generally speaking, if you do the right thing, you'll expect good things to happen. Generally speaking, things will go better for you if you do the right thing rather than the wrong thing. Well, things go worse for Joseph here because he does the right thing. And that happens sometimes when it's God's plan for that to happen for someone. That's a challenge to your faith, that I deliberately obeyed God here, and my life is worse because of it. far worse.
Isn't there one of the epistles where they say something about that you should expect to be punished for doing evil, but the real mark of a Christian is sometimes when you get punished for doing the right thing?
Yes. Yeah. Romans chapter 13, first of all, says, do right and you should expect to be rewarded. And then it's, I believe it's First Peter, which says, well, if you suffer for doing wrong, what credit is that to you? But if you suffer for doing right, rejoice. Yeah. So generally speaking, we will still teach our kids to do the right thing, and that things will generally be better for them if they do the right thing. But that is not an absolute promise. In fact, sometimes things will go worse for you or seem to be worse for you because you do the right thing. Yet God is still in charge of everything, and he will work out his plan according to the timetable that he's set in his own mind. So, anything else on that? Then let's go on to the last question here. Who was the object of Potiphar's anger?
So you're saying it wasn't Joseph?
Well, if it had been Joseph, where would Joseph be?
There.
Joseph has no legal rights whatsoever. Joseph is property. If Potiphar is mad at Joseph, Joseph's a dead man. Potiphar is very angry, but he's not angry at Joseph. He's angry at his wife. Or maybe that's even going that's probably the case, but the one thing we can say for sure, he's angry at the situation. What does he lose? He loses this valued slave that is in charge of his whole household. Potiphar has been blessed because Joseph is in charge of everything. Potiphar is the one then who arranges for Joseph to go to jail. And we see by the people who are in jail later, next week we'll talk about the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. This is a royal prison. This isn't just where a thief off of the street is thrown if he's caught. This is a royal prison. And Potiphar is probably able to pull some strings and get Joseph thrown in there. He can't be Joseph's slave anymore. I mean, he can't have Joseph as his slave in charge of his household anymore because his wife has made an accusation against him. Well, his wife has a certain legal standing. Joseph does not. But Joseph. Yes, Helga.
Well, we're talking about the parallels too between Jesus' life and Joseph's life. And here in Jesus' life, Satan was angry at God, and therefore he orchestrated all of the things with God's permission, obviously. And when you think about Potiphar, well, who is the one that's leading Potiphar's thinking process? Isn't that Satan? And Satan is angry at God. So Joseph's faith is in God is so strong. So it's a battle between God and Satan again, or before Jesus was born, obviously, but that's where I see a parallel here.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any aspersions to cast on Potiphar here. I think Potiphar does what he can in order to spare Joseph's life.
And so he doesn't face.
Right, he has to acknowledge his wife's accusation even if he doesn't believe it. Potiphar's probably no dummy. He knows what kind of woman his wife is. He knows what kind of person Joseph is. It's hard to imagine that Potiphar didn't pull Joseph aside and say, "What happened here?" And Joseph would have told the truth.
I think I really meant Potiphar's wife, not him, but her, because she was being that. Yeah. I think I just didn't express myself well because she is the one that represents the evil person here.
Yeah, she is. Yeah, there's not a lot good you can say about Potiphar's wife. That's for sure. Maybe she became a better person later in life. I don't know. But Jim.
Couldn't Potiphar just said the heck with it and kept Joseph as a servant?
Well, who's Joseph? Joseph is a slave from a foreign land here. And who's his, who knows? We're not told the lineage of Potiphar's wife, but she might be an important person because of the family she was born into. These are important people, Potiphar and his wife. And when you look at most of human history, there have been classes of people. We have this unique situation in America where we're all equal under the law. That's not the way it usually is. In human history, there are people who have more rights, and there are some people who have absolutely no rights. And a slave is a practically subhuman creature who can certainly not do anything to a noble person and get away with it.
Does it say what kind of office Potiphar held in Egypt?
Yeah, captain of the guard. Wasn't go to
Because
Genesis.
why he was thrown into a royal prison instead of just a local precinct or something?
The executive jail, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah, captain of the guard, one of Pharaoh's officials. So he's what the equivalent of the head of the Secret Service.
Camp Cupcake like Martha Stewart.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this isn't Paul being thrown into prison the second time in Rome, chained to a wall. This is more like Paul's first time in prison under house arrest, perhaps. This isn't the worst place in the world necessarily for him to be. It's prison. It's not a great situation, but it's not as bad as it could be. Okay, moving on with the last few verses that we'll consider today then. But the Lord was with Joseph. He showed mercy to him and gave him favor in the sight of the warden of the prison. The warden of the prison made Joseph responsible for all the prisoners who were in the prison. Joseph was responsible for whatever they did there. The warden of the prison did not pay attention to anything that was under his authority because the Lord was with Joseph and the Lord made everything that he did succeed. Okay. What lessons about God do these verses teach us?
God is in control.
God's in control even of the way people think of us, even of people's attitude towards us. If it serves God's purposes and our ultimate good for people to think ill of us, God will see to it that that happens. If it serves God's purposes and our good for people to think well of us, God will see to it that that happens. Boy, doesn't that take a lot of pressure off of you? You don't have to make people like you. This is in God's hands. And God saw fit for Potiphar's wife to hate Joseph with that intense hatred. And God sees fit for the warden of the prison to act favorably towards Joseph, to give Joseph responsibility over all the other prisoners. That's an amazing thing to have happen when you consider that, as we see later, this is a royal prison, the royal cupbearer, the royal baker are in there, and Joseph, a foreign slave, is given authority over them in a way.
kind of a sideward move.
Yeah, very much so. He's already been a slave in someone's house. He's just, now he's a slave in prison, but he still has authority. What's God doing too? Well, also in these episodes of Joseph's life where he has the authority over Potiphar's household, the authority in the prison, he's learning administration. He's going to be gaining skills that are going to be put to good use later in Joseph's life. God is training him. Just like Moses, our next hero of faith, goes out into the wilderness for 40 years, and God, in a sense, trains him how to deal with living in the wilderness, because that's what he's going to be doing, leading people out into the wilderness, trains him for a long period of time. God trains Joseph. Joseph hasn't done anything to deserve being sold into slavery, being falsely accused, being thrown into prison. He could sit there and say, this just isn't fair. This isn't how I planned my life. There's someone else who has a plan for his life. And these are steps along the way of Joseph, God getting Joseph to where God means for him to be.
I always kind of hate the warden because I feel like he's sloughing off on his job. And, he's getting paid to do something, but instead he gives it to.
It almost reads that way in verse 23, did not pay attention to anything that was under his authority. I think the sense is he didn't worry about it. He wasn't like, he didn't have to check and double check all of the prisoners' locks and so on and so forth, because he'd given it to Joseph. And giving it to Joseph, he knew it was done. So in that sense, it's an expression of the total confidence he's able to have in Joseph.
I think of this almost as a parable that Jesus talked about. It was like what a parable was, like the sower of the seed. The seed, and then the seed was the word of God. Well, here's this Joseph guy. He has his ups and downs in life, but it ends happily ever after, and he becomes very successful, and he, dies a happy man, and with a good relationship to God. Where Jesus came into the world, he was humiliated for us, but now he's exalted, he's in heaven, and that ends happily ever after also. So 2 stories that end happily ever after.
Yep, and of course we'll be talking about that next week in the context of continuing looking at the parallels between Jesus' life and Joseph's life, how they end, and the humiliation and the exaltation. Yeah,
I might forget that comment by next week. So
okay, that's perfectly fine. Okay, we might think of Joseph needing to wait until he is made ruler of Egypt before he could consider himself a success. How does this episode of Joseph's life give us insight into the true meaning of success?
I think you can have many successes throughout life. They may not. There's different types of victories that you get throughout your life.
Well, what defines a success apart from a failure?
I think of it being having peace with yourself. It's not just dollars and cents as a success, but just going to bed at night and feeling that you had a good day and you're thankful for whatever happened that day.
Is Joseph a success here at this point in his life?
Yes, he is.
Yeah, it says he is. The Lord made everything that he did succeed.
I guess those looking at the situation during that time wouldn't consider it.
Right. Yeah, we might, from a human point of view, we may not evaluate him as a success, but God does. And more than that, Joseph knows that God does.
And that's the key.
Yeah. And so our success in life, and even those little successes that Gary was referencing, have much more to do with how connected we are to God than the outcome of whatever it is that we're attempting. I may plan for something and those plans don't come to pass, but I trust in God. Thus, it's a success because I know God is working through this to accomplish his good purpose. On the other hand, I may do something sinful apart from God's will, and I may achieve some sort of earthly goal. I get more money. I do something. I attain some pleasure. I may regard that as a success because I got what I set out to get, but I did it apart from my relationship with God. I damaged my relationship with God. That wasn't a success. Even how I feel about things isn't the gauge of whether things are successful or not. It's what I know about my God and how he works in my life. And things may not turn out the way that I want them to, but that doesn't define success or failure for me. So Joseph, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just was going to ask, could we not define success in our lives, bringing glory to God in any circumstance because he's achieving his purposes?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful way to put it. Bring glory to God in every circumstance. Yeah, you can't, and no one can make a statement like that apart from faith, where like, I'm here because God has arranged events inside and even outside my life so that I'm here. And I'm here to bring God glory. I confess my God. So yeah, that's a wonderful way to put it. And doesn't Joseph do the same thing? The warden of the prison did not pay any attention to anything because the Lord was with Joseph. And we've got a comment earlier in Genesis 39 that Potiphar sees that the Lord was with him. That doesn't mean Potiphar confesses the Lord as his God, but it means that Joseph has somewhat probably let him know along the way, this is the God I worship, and this is why I'm going to do my best possible work for you, because the Lord has brought me here. Joseph is sold into slavery, he's still a success. Joseph is a slave, he's still a success. Joseph is falsely accused and thrown into prison, he's still a success because his faith is strong. And we think if we're going to define success by your status in life, well, we're going to have to call certain people successes who are actually tragic failures because they don't have God in their life. And we're going to ignore people who truly are successes because of the faith God has granted them. And just because they have a humble status here on earth. The Apostle James writes about the poor people in the Christian congregation to whom he's writing. They have a high position. They are really successful, those poor people. Okay, anything else up to this point on Joseph's life?
I was just going to add, we certainly could not look at Jesus as a success, could we, in his life?
All right, who would evaluate Jesus as a success according to purely earthly standards? He got a large following for a while. Almost everyone in that following left him. In fact, even his closest disciples abandoned him in his deepest need, and there he dies the most painful and humiliating death.
But a lot of times that following was to see another miracle.
Yeah, exactly. So, but we don't define success by the numbers of people who are listening to our message, the great things other people say about us. We don't look for the praise of other people. Simply seek to do God's will, bring him glory, confess our faith in him. So, Dave.
The idea that he was sold for 20 pieces of silver, is there something in one of the books of Moses about what a slave was worth, and like a woman slave and a man slave?
There is. I don't have that on the top of my head. Let me make a note.
The year of Jubilee, how much you paid for a slave, how many years until that year that they could be freed again or something?
There is. Now remember though, that's all written 400 years later. There may have been inflation. No, I'll look into that for next time. I haven't researched that for today.
When
but
Jesus comes along, it's 30 and
yeah,
with inflation.
With inflation, right. Okay. Well, before we turn it over to Gary and our prayer group for today, let's close with a short prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we confess that too often we've evaluated our lives according to the outcomes and whether or not they were favorable to the way we felt we wanted things to be. We look at the life of Joseph and we see that success is certainly not defined by the outcomes necessarily. And yet when you choose to do so, you will grant favorable outcomes to us, not because we've earned or deserved them, but because you love us. Certainly the one favorable outcome that we can count on is the ultimate one, the eternity in heaven that was won for us by Jesus our Lord. In his name we pray and thank you for this time together. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, anyone else out there have anything to share before we turn it over to Gary? All right, thanks for joining us this morning. And though I'll mention it in the context of prayer group too,